We're boxed in. No exits. Ridge is dead. That was the last call from the SEAL unit, seconds before a gunshot cracked from the very ridge they marked unreachable. One enemy dropped, then another, then three more. The ambush turned into confusion. Someone was up there, but no sniper team had been deployed. No name, no clearance, no record. Just 3 perfect shots from nowhere that saved 6 lives. What if the one person you thought was just a technician had already survived the kill zone you were walking into? Would you even recognize a legend if she stayed silent? You're watching Veteran Biker. We know you're here. Drop a 1 if you're new, or 2 if you've been with us. Like, subscribe, and prepare to be humbled. The Linden Valley was a wound in the earth, a jagged tear of rock and ice that bit deep into the heart of the mountains. A silence reigned here, not of peace, but of suspended animation, as if the landscape itself was holding its breath. Below the rim, the wind was a low, mournful sigh, but up on the ridges, it was a predator's shriek, sharp and unforgiving. It was into this throat of stone that a 6-man SEAL unit, designated Echo 6, descended. They moved like shadows, their movements a practiced choreography of silent steps and hand signals. Every piece of their gear was carefully secured to prevent the slightest clink of metal against metal. The air was a razor slicing at any exposed skin, and the snow a fine powdery dust clung to their black and grey fatigues. Commander Holt, a man whose face was a roadmap of previous conflicts, led the way. His eyes, though weary, missed nothing. He scanned every crag, every patch of dense pine growth, every crevice that could conceal a threat. The mission was simple on paper. Disable a low-frequency enemy comms relay believed to be nestled deep within the canyon. Intelligence suggested a skeleton crew of guards, perhaps a dozen men at most. It was supposed to be a surgical strike, a ghost operation. But a prickle of unease had been riding Holt's neck since they'd left the briefing room. It was a faint, almost subliminal feeling, a discordant note in the otherwise perfect symphony of his tactical preparation. The feeling was tied to a data glitch, a phantom anomaly that had shown up on the server logs hours before deployment. The key terrain mapping file for Linden Valley, a crucial 3D scan of every rock and ridge, had vanished. Not deleted, not moved, simply gone, scrubbed with no trace. The base's senior analysts had shrugged, attributing it to a server hiccup. Holt, however, knew better. Servers don't hiccup away critical data. Behind him, Lieutenant Bennett, a young, eager operator with a reputation for being hot-headed but skilled, moved with the restless energy of a caged animal. Bennett's movements, though precise, lacked the fluid patience of the older SEALs. He glanced up at the jagged cliffs that towered above them, a frown etched on his face. This place felt wrong. Too quiet, too perfect. Holt, catching his eye, gave a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Focus. Not on the feeling, but on the terrain. The team had been moving for nearly an hour when they reached a narrow passage between 2 sheer rock faces. The cliffs here were so close they seemed to lean in, whispering secrets of gravity and time. The comms relay was just ahead, a small camouflage structure nestled in a natural alcove. They fanned out, taking up positions, their rifles trained on the objective. Holt raised his hand, signaling a halt. He waited, listening not just with his ears, but with his skin, for the subtle vibrations of the ground, for the unnatural stillness of a hidden ambush. Nothing. The wind was the only sound, a constant abrasive hiss. It should have been a comfort, but to a soldier, absolute silence is a lie. Then the world shattered. It began not with a deafening blast, but with a series of sharp, dry cracks. The sound of rifle fire, but not from one direction. The first rounds ripped into the cliff face above them, sending a shower of white stone and splinters of ice raining down. Then came the rattle of a machine gun, its heavy rounds chewing into the rock to their left. And finally, from a position behind them, the snap and pop of a third shooter, cutting off their only retreat. 3 directions. The realization hit Holt like a physical blow. They hadn't walked into a trap. They had walked into a kill zone. Contact. 3 o'clock high, 11 o'clock left, 6 o'clock rear. Bennett's voice, usually a confident baritone, was a strained whisper of frantic information. Get down! Low cover! Holt's command was a reflex, a primal instinct born of 100 firefights. They scrambled, pressing their bodies against the cold, unforgiving stone. The air was filled with a discordant chorus of muzzle reports and the high-pitched whistle of ricocheting bullets. The rounds were not aimed randomly. They were targeted, designed to pin the unit down, to limit their every move. Holt tried to raise the base on his radio. He thumbed the PTT button, his thumb a white spot against the worn plastic. Echo 6. This is Echo 6 Actual. We are in a kill zone. Repeat, we are in a kill zone. Requesting immediate support. Over. The radio spat back only static, a hollow, mocking hiss that sounded like the valley itself laughing at their plight. All channels were dead. Jammed. They were on their own. Panic, a cold, venomous snake, began to coil in the pit of Holt's stomach. It was a familiar feeling, one he had learned to master over years of combat, but this time it was different. This wasn't just a tough fight, this was a setup. The enemy had known they were coming. The missing terrain file, the suspiciously quiet approach, it all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This was a replay of a tactical ghost story he had heard whispered in the barracks, a story about a unit that disappeared without a trace in a canyon, very much like this one, a ghost story that was, he now realized, a cautionary tale. His scope, a high magnification window into the chaos, gave him a bird's-eye view of their predicament. The ambushers were methodical. One heavy machine gun team on a ledge to their left, laying down suppressing fire, a sniper on the high ground to their right, taking pot shots at any movement. And a third element, hidden in the pines behind them, preventing any retreat. There was no way out, no flanking routes, no high ground they could ascend, and no aerial support coming. The clouds had rolled in, heavy and low, obscuring the sky. The canyon was a steel trap, and they were the prey. Bennett, wedged in a narrow crevice, turned his helmeted head toward Holt. His eyes, visible through the night vision lenses of his visor, were wide with a question Holt couldn't answer. What now? Holt could only shake his head. They were trapped. Their comms were gone, their path forward was blocked, and their retreat was cut off. He had 2 choices, a slow, methodical bleed out under the constant punishing fire, or a desperate, suicidal charge. He watched as a round from the high ground struck a rock barely inches from the head of his point man. The cold, unyielding pressure of the stone against his cheek, the constant heart-pounding drum of automatic fire, the whistle of 1,000 small projectiles seeking a home. It was a symphony of despair. Then the symphony stopped, not with a whimper, but with a single, sharp, impossibly loud crack. It was the sound of a high-powered sniper rifle, distinct from the smaller caliber rounds that had been peppering their position. It didn't come from the left or the right or the rear. It came from above, from a crag that towered over all the others, a jagged, unforgiving peak that Holt and his team had pre-scouted. They had labeled it in their tactical maps as unscalable, a dead zone, Ridge 9. The sound hung in the air for a fraction of a second, an echo that reverberated through the canyon walls. Then the heavy machine gun to their left, which had been laying down a relentless stream of suppressing fire, fell silent. Holt, heart hammering against his ribs, raised his binoculars, panning them to the source of the gunfire. The machine gunner, a dark shape against the snowy ledge, had collapsed forward onto his weapon. A clean hit. No hesitation, no missed shots. One bullet, one kill. The rounds from the other two enemy positions faltered. The sudden silence from the machine gun position had thrown them off their rhythm. A ripple of confusion ran through the ambush formation. They were no longer hunters. They were now the hunted. Bennett, from his position, let out a strangled whisper of disbelief. Who the hell was that? The question hung in the air, unanswered. The silence that followed the first shot was broken only by the wind, which seemed to carry a new electric energy. Holt's eyes were glued to his scope, sweeping the barren face of Ridge 9, but he saw nothing. No movement, no glint of sunlight on a rifle scope, no flash of a muzzle. The ridge was a blank canvas, a testament to the impossible. The ambushers, now completely disoriented, began to yell, their voices carrying on the wind in a torrent of furious, panicked commands. They had prepared for a six-man SEAL team, a direct confrontation. They had not prepared for an invisible enemy from a place they thought was impossible to reach. The second shot came with the same brutal, uncompromising efficiency. Crack! It struck the enemy sniper on the high ground to their right. His rifle, a long black shadow, clattered onto the rocks, followed by his body, which tumbled lifelessly into a snowdrift below. 2 shots, 2 targets eliminated, both of whom had a clear view of the SEAL's position. The remaining enemy soldiers, now without their 2 primary fire sources, began to unravel completely. Their commands became frantic, disorganized. They were firing blindly now, their rounds hitting the cliffs with a new, desperate kind of fury. Holt, his breath misting in the cold air, felt a strange, chilling sensation wash over him. It was a mixture of fear and awe. He knew the rifle, he knew the distance, and he knew the wind. The shots were a masterpiece of ballistics, a perfect fusion of skill, instinct, and a deep, almost intimate knowledge of the terrain. He had seen shots like this before, but only in the quiet whispers of legend, in the files of ghost missions that were never officially documented. He thought back to the missing terrain file, the one that had been scrubbed clean. The base had no record of it, no way to even acknowledge its existence. But someone had had it. Someone had needed it. Then the third shot. Crack. It was the final brutal punctuation mark on the ambush. This one hit the commander of the hostile force, a man visible only for a split second as he stood to rally his troops in the pines behind the SEALs. He dropped without a sound. 3 shots, 3 key targets, all with surgical precision. The remaining enemy soldiers, leaderless and without their key support positions, broke rank. They began to retreat in a panicked, disorganized mob, running back into the treacherous folds of the valley. The kill zone had become a clean extraction. The silence that followed was different now. It was not the cold, oppressive silence of the trap, but the stunned, disbelieving silence of survival. Holt slowly lowered his binoculars. The lenses misted with the heat of his own surprise. He looked at his team, all still pressed against the stone, their faces a mixture of confusion and relief. Bennett, once again, was the first to break the stillness, his voice barely audible. Who was that, Commander? Holt didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the peak of Ridge 9, a place that, according to all tactical information, was a barren, unusable crag. He had read the intelligence briefs. He had seen the satellite scans. Ridge 9 was a dead zone. And yet, from that dead zone, a ghost had just saved their lives. The whispers from the base, the strange silence around certain files, the name that he had heard mentioned only in hushed tones. A systems analyst who was never seen with a weapon, a quiet presence in the corners of the briefing room. A person they all called Ghost Tech. Holt raised his binoculars one last time, scanning the impossible ridge. He knew what he wouldn't see. He knew there would be no glint of glass, no flash of a muzzle, no sign of a human presence. He had felt it in the cold air, heard it in the precise, uncompromising crack of the rifle, and seen it in the collapsing bodies of their enemy. She wasn't just on the ridge. She was the ridge. He lowered his binoculars, a slow, deliberate movement. His lips, chapped and dry from the cold, formed a single whispered word, a statement of fact, of chilling certainty, of awe. "She's here." The sterile hum of the Echo Ridge 12 command center was a stark contrast to the brutal silence and chaotic gunfire of the Linden Valley. Here, the air was cold but still, heavy with the scent of recycled oxygen and stale coffee. Screens flickered with endless streams of data, green lines on black backgrounds, a digitized representation of a world far too complex to be contained within pixels. The sense of panic, while present, was muted, a low-frequency hum of anxious whispers and sharp, clipped commands. Officers bent over their terminals, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow, struggling to make sense of a situation that defied their tactical models. In a far, quiet corner of the room, almost as if she were part of the furniture, sat Erin Voss. At 30 years old, she was a study in minimalism. Her pale blonde hair, a shade so light it was almost white, was pulled back into a knot so tight it seemed to defy gravity. She wore the standard-issue weather-resistant jacket, but it seemed to hang on her small frame, a garment that had never quite been broken in. Her colleagues, a collection of grizzled veterans and sharp-minded young analysts, rarely noticed her. They knew her simply as Ghost Tech, a half-joking nickname born from her silent presence and her uncanny ability to appear and disappear without a sound. Her world was not the chaotic one playing out on the central screen, but a 3D topographic scan of the Linden Valley, a personal sandbox she had been studying for weeks. To the others, it was a grid of elevation lines and color-coded zones. To Erin, it was a living, breathing thing. It was a diary etched in stone, a book she had written and read countless times before. She saw not just the peaks and the valleys, but the subtle shifts in wind, the way snow would drift at noon, the precise angle of sunlight at dawn. She saw the places no textbook ever mentioned, the narrow hidden passes, the forgotten overhangs, the spots where a single human being could disappear for days. The radio static, now a persistent hiss, was the only sound that pierced her concentration. It was the sound of a vacuum, of a mission falling apart. Her eyes, a startlingly clear shade of grey, never left her screen. She watched the dots representing the SEAL unit, Echo 6, freeze in place. She saw the red flash, a visual representation of incoming fire, bloom around their position. She didn't need to hear the frantic comms from Commander Holt to know what was happening. She had been there before. The screen in front of her wasn't just showing a live map, it was showing a ghost. It was showing her 3 years earlier she had been a different person, not Erin Voss, the quiet systems analyst, but sniper call sign 452 of the Valkyrie Echo Recon Unit. Her uniform hadn't been a sterile tech jacket, but the heavy, worn-in fatigues of a mountain operative. Her world had been one of deep, bone-chilling cold, of wind that could strip the heat from your bones, and of a silence broken only by the methodical rhythm of her own breathing. Her team, a band of 6 elite mountain climbers and tactical specialists, had been her family. They had trained together for years, learning to read the land with an intimacy that felt almost sacred. They knew the Linden Valley better than anyone. They had named every ridge, every crevice, every path. Ridge 9 had been their overwatch, their sanctuary, their untouchable high ground. The mission that had ultimately shattered them had been simple: set up forward observation posts for a civilian convoy moving through the northern line. But the intelligence had been compromised. What should have been a ghost stop had been a meticulously planned ambush, a kill zone sprung shut with devastating speed. Erin, as the team's overwatch, had been positioned on Ridge 9. She had watched, helpless, as her team was systematically picked off below. The radios went dead, just as they had today. Her orders were absolute: maintain radio silence, do not compromise her position. Breaking it would have revealed her and the convoy she was protecting to the enemy artillery waiting in the surrounding peaks. For 3 days she had held her position, a ghost on a mountain she knew like the back of her hand, watching her family die one by one, unable to help. The survivor's guilt had been a physical weight she carried from that day forward. She had survived, but the price had been the lives of her team. Her memories were interrupted by the frantic voice of a junior analyst. "We're showing 0 comms from Echo 6, Commander. All channels are jammed, and the satellite feed is showing heavy cloud cover. No aerial support is possible." Erin didn't react. She had already known. The patterns were identical. The static on the comms, the clouds rolling in, the location of the ambush. It was a nightmare playing out again. An old story that the Mountain had decided to retell. The memory of the M2010 sniper rifle in the armory flashed through her mind, a cold, hard image of steel and wood. She had walked past it 14 times. She had studied it, not just with her eyes, but with her hands, with a quiet understanding that went far beyond its superficial flaws. The rifle had been marked unreliable, its scope deemed too sensitive to the extreme cold, its accuracy drifting with the vertical heat drafts of high-altitude shooting. The armorers had dismissed it, labeling it a liability. But Erin had seen something they had missed. The problem wasn't the rifle itself, it was the mount, a piece of equipment designed for flat, predictable terrain, not for the unforgiving angles of the Linden Valley. Just 3 weeks ago, she had slipped into the armory, a ghost in the shadows. The armory guard on shift, a bored-looking private first class named Jenkins, had barely registered her presence. He was more concerned with the game on his portable screen than with the quiet tech girl who was logging inventory. "Don't touch that M110, analyst," he had quipped, not even looking up. "Those aren't for you." She had offered him a small, almost invisible smile. Her gaze was not on the M110, but on another rifle entirely. The M2010 she had signed into the logbook, her temporary clearance for long-range support arms already pre-approved by a system she herself had configured. The system, to its credit, didn't question her. It saw a user with the right clearance, not a tech girl from a remote outpost. She hadn't just fixed the rifle, she had meticulously recalibrated it. In a window of time no one had noticed, she had worked with the precision of a watchmaker. She had replaced the mount with one of her own design, a piece of custom engineering she had quietly fabricated in her downtime, using scavenged parts from the base's maintenance junk heap. It was a mount designed not for flat ground, but for the unforgiving steep-angle shooting of Ridge 9. She had tuned the scope for the specific atmospheric pressures of the valley, a subtle calibration that no one else would have even known to make. The rifle, once a pariah, was now a surgical instrument, waiting patiently for the moment it was needed. For her, it wasn't just a rifle, it was an old friend, a promise to the Mountain she had left behind. The command center was a whirlwind of activity now. Commander Holt's radio transmission, a brief frantic message followed by silence, had set off a chain reaction of panicked protocols. "We are in a kill zone," his voice had rasped, a ghost on the airwaves, before the line went dead. The officers were scrambling, but they were working in a vacuum, with no intel, no communication, no way to help. Erin's hands, though still and quiet on her keyboard, trembled with a contained fury. She watched the dots on her screen, motionless, a picture of a 6-man unit waiting for a fate she knew all too well. The map once a static representation of terrain, had suddenly become a personal archive of her past. She saw not just the ambush, but the faces of her team, their bodies falling on the same rocks, under the same clouds. It wasn't vengeance that drove her. Vengeance was a hot, messy emotion, and Erin was a creature of cold, methodical precision. It was something far stronger, far more deeply ingrained in her psyche. It was the unwavering decision that she would never again stand by while others died. Not when she had the power to intervene, not when the pattern was so clear, so undeniably a repeat of her personal nightmare. She had survived the mountain once, a survivor by circumstance. This time she would choose to be a protector. She slowly took off her headset, the motion so quiet it went unnoticed by the frantic officers around her. She closed her laptop, the click of the latch a final decisive sound in the clamor of the command center. She stood up, her small frame a stark contrast to the imposing presence of the military brass. She didn't ask for clearance. She didn't file paperwork. She didn't offer an explanation. She simply turned and walked toward the armory, her steps a silent, determined rhythm. The walk to the armory was a journey back in time. With every step, she shed the identity of Erin Voss, the quiet tech girl. The familiar scent of gun oil and cold steel hit her as she pushed open the heavy blast door. Jenkins, the guard, was exactly where she had left him, still engrossed in his game. He glanced up, annoyance flickering in his eyes. He recognized her. "Hey, you can't be in here after hours. This is—" Erin didn't stop. She walked right past him, her eyes fixed on a specific rack in the far corner of the room. The M2010 sat there, a silent sentinel waiting for its purpose. Jenkins' mouth hung open in a silent protest as he watched her. His pre-programmed response was to ask for her clearance, to remind her that analysts didn't have access to combat rifles, but the look in her eyes, a focused intensity that he had never seen before, stopped him cold. It wasn't the look of a tech girl. It was the look of a predator returning to its home range. She reached for the rifle, her fingers, delicate and slender, wrapped around the cold steel of the barrel, a familiar, almost forgotten sensation. The wood of the stock felt like an old friend against her palm. It was clean, cold and ready. The recalibrated scope was a perfect, precise extension of her own gaze. Her entire body hummed with a quiet, powerful energy, a silent conversation she was having with the weapon, with the mountain, with her own past. Jenkins, now completely forgotten, could only watch as she unlatched the rifle from its rack and slung it over her shoulder. The rifle, once dismissed as unreliable, now looked like the only thing in the room that made sense. She turned and walked out of the armory, the heavy door thudding shut behind her. Her mind was a map of the Linden Valley, a detailed three-dimensional model of every rock, every shadow, every thermal draft. She saw the path to Ridge 9, not as a series of punishing inclines, but as a journey of memory. The mountain was calling, and this time she would answer. She would not be a ghost, watching from a distance. She would be a ghost, fighting for them. The outpost gates were a cold, brutalist structure of steel and concrete, a man-made scar on the face of a wild and beautiful world. To step through them was to trade the sterile hum of human technology for the raw, untamed fury of nature. Erin Voss, M2010, slung across her back, moved with a silent purpose that seemed to belong more to the mountains than to the base. Her boots, designed for tactical use, bit into the hard-packed snow with a familiar crunch. She didn't check a map, didn't glance at a compass. Her path was etched not in a digital screen, but in the deepest parts of her memory, a path she had walked, crawled, and bled on before. The wind, a constant howling presence, was her only companion. It was a freezing, high-altitude wind, a living entity that sought to strip the warmth from her bones. It was the same wind that had whispered secrets to her 3 years ago, a language of shifts and drafts that she had learned to read as intimately as a mother reads a child's face. The 2.6-kilometer ascent to Ridge 9 was not a journey, it was a return. To a soldier trained for deep mountain infiltration, the vertical climb was a physical challenge, a battle against gravity and endurance. To Erin, it was a pilgrimage. Her small frame moved with a deceptive strength, her muscles working in a smooth, practiced rhythm. Every footfall was deliberate, every handhold chosen not for its immediate security, but for its place in the greater, complex ballet of the ascent. She moved like water flowing uphill, finding the path of least resistance with a preternatural instinct. The M2010 felt heavy on her back, a familiar weight, a piece of her past that had finally found its way back to her. The cold steel of the rifle, even through the fabric of her field jacket, was a constant reminder of who she was before she became Ghost Tech. It was a cold promise, an oath forged in steel and fire. As she moved higher, the memories came. They were not sudden, jarring flashbacks, but a seamless layering of past onto present, like old photographs appearing in chemical light. The sight of a particular granite outcropping brought back the image of her teammate Marcus, laughing as he taught her how to measure range by the sound of a rock falling into a crevasse. The way a snowdrift curved against a cliff face reminded her of Elena, her spotter, whose keen eyes could spot a single stray hair in the lens of an enemy scope from 2 kilometers out. They were all there, in the wind, in the snow, in the very air she was breathing. They were her Valkyrie echo. Her mind drifted back to the training, the grueling, relentless years spent forging a team that was more than just a unit. They had been a family bound by shared hardship and a profound, unshakable trust. They were experts in silence, in shadows, in surviving on the edges of the map. Their mission in the Linden Valley was to be their magnum opus, the culmination of everything they had worked for. She remembered the briefing room, the confident smiles, the easy banter. They were untouchable, they believed. They were the best. But no amount of skill could prepare a team for a compromised intel file. The climb continued, a silent, methodical dance. Her breath was steady, a controlled internal furnace that kept her body running with maximum efficiency. She was moving faster than any of the base's tactical models would have predicted, faster than her own file, with its note of non-combat placement, would have suggested was possible. She didn't pause at forks in the trail. She knew every one of them, knew which one led to a thermal vent that could mask her presence, and which one led to a dead end that would funnel her into the open. Her knowledge of the mountain was not just a map. It was a personal archive of every footstep, every shadow, every heartbeat of a team she had lost. She remembered the moment the world had fallen apart. She had been in her Overwatch position on Ridge 9, the M2010, a steady presence in her hands, its scope a clean window into the world below. Her team was in position, ready to provide eyes on the enemy logistics passing through the canyon. Everything was quiet. Then the comms went dead, not with a burst of static, but with a sudden, eerie silence. Her team's voices, the lifeline that connected them, were gone. She had watched, helpless, as the ambush unfolded below. The enemy was not just a small patrol, but a well-coordinated force, their movements a reflection of a strategy she had seen only in classified wargame simulations. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The intel had been a lie. Her team had walked into a trap, and she, the Overwatch, was now a ghost, a witness to a massacre she could not prevent. Her orders had been absolute: maintain radio silence. If she transmitted, she would give away her position. And more importantly, she would alert the enemy to the presence of the humanitarian convoy moving through the lower valley, the very reason her team had been there. For 3 days she had held her position, her body numb with cold, her mind a maelstrom of agony and guilt. She watched them die, one by one, their tactical prowess no match for the overwhelming numbers of the ambushers. She watched as they fought, as they fell, and as the mountain claimed their bodies. The cold had been her only companion, her only witness. Then, on the 3rd day, she had seen it, a telltale plume of black smoke, a thermal signature she knew all too well, rising from a sheltered position in the distant hills. It was the enemy's mortar setup, a powerful artillery emplacement designed to lay down a final devastating barrage. She had watched as they began to sight their targets. It wasn't her team they were targeting anymore. It was the convoy. Her orders were still firm: maintain silence. But she couldn't. She had watched her family die, but she would not watch as the lives of hundreds of civilians were extinguished in a single brutal volley. She had made a choice: 3 shots, each one a masterpiece of ballistics, a work of art born from years of training and a deep visceral hatred of her own helplessness. The 3 forward observers, the eyes of the enemy artillery, had gone down. Her shots had been so precise, so unexpected, that the enemy was blind. The convoy had escaped, but in those 3 shots she had given up her position. Her current ascent was nearing its end. She could feel the change in the air pressure, the subtle shift in the wind currents. She was almost home. The memory of her last stand on the mountain, the 6 days of survival, the frostbite, the dehydration, the relentless hunt by an entire battalion of enemy soldiers. It was all a part of her, a fabric woven into the very fiber of her being. She had survived by becoming one with the land, by reading the shadows, by moving with the storms. She had returned to the base, a ghost in her own skin, a woman who had seen the worst of humanity and had chosen to fade into the system, to become invisible. Then she saw it. A plume of thin, dark smoke snaked its way up from a position in the hills below, a familiar black smudge against the white canvas of the snow. Her heart, which had been beating in a steady, controlled rhythm, hitched in her chest. She stopped her ascent, her body freezing in place. She raised her binoculars, her hands steady as a rock. Through the lens, the smoke was clearer now. It was rising from the same sheltered spot, the same tactical position as the mortar setup that had destroyed her team 3 years ago. The realization was not a thought, it was a physical sensation, a cold wave of déjà vu that crashed over her. The cycle was repeating, the same ambush, the same tactics, the same artillery setup. They were reusing the same playbook, but this time she was on the field. She was not a silent witness. Her heart, which had just skipped a beat, now settled into a calm, steady rhythm. The rage, the guilt, the pain, it all receded, replaced by a cold, unwavering sense of purpose. This was not just a mission, this was a chance to confront a ghost, to break a cycle that had haunted her for 3 long years. She had spent 1,000 days running from her past. Now she was running toward it. She reached the summit of Ridge 9. It was a familiar landscape, a collection of sharp, unforgiving rocks and hard-packed snow. She found her old position, the very rock where she had spent 6 days watching, waiting, and surviving. Her movements were not the frantic ones of a soldier in a hurry, but the deliberate, graceful motions of an artist preparing her canvas. She lowered the M2010 from her back, its cold steel a welcome presence in her hands. She set it down on the rock, a final, definitive action. The rifle had been recalibrated for this moment, for this ridge, for this particular angle of shooting. She took a moment to adjust the bipod, to align the scope with the valley below, a valley filled with the ghosts of her past and the lives she was here to save. She exhaled slowly, a long, controlled breath that misted in the cold air. Her mind was a blank slate, her senses a heightened web of awareness. She was no longer Erin Voss, the analyst. She was call sign 452. She was home. The sound of the second shot was not a surprise. It was an inevitability, a punctuation mark on a sentence of certain doom that had been suddenly, brutally rewritten. The first shot had shattered the ambush's rhythm, but the remaining enemy forces were still in a kill zone mindset. The heavy machine gunner to their left was gone, his relentless stream of fire silenced, but the sniper to their right and the commander in the pines behind them were still very much alive, their rounds still impacting the rock just inches from the SEAL team's position. The momentary confusion of the ambushers had given way to a frantic, disorganized fury. They were no longer methodical hunters. They were now cornered animals, lashing out blindly. Commander Holt's eyes were locked on his scope, his heart pounding a frantic tattoo against his ribs. He was not looking for a target anymore. He was looking for a ghost. His scope panned across the impossibly high peak of Ridge 9, a jagged, snow-covered crag that stood like a silent monolith against the grey sky. He saw nothing, no muzzle flash, no glint of glass, no flicker of movement. It was as if the first shot had been a figment of his imagination, a collective hallucination born from the desperation of their predicament. He felt a cold dread begin to creep into his gut, a fear that the silence from the ridge was a sign that their mysterious savior was gone. Then it came, a second dry, uncompromising crack. It was followed not by the sound of a body hitting the rocks, but by the high-pitched whistle of a rifle tumbling over the edge. Holt's scope was already there. The enemy sniper who had been pinning them down with a methodical precision was gone. His weapon, a long dark shadow, spun end over end before disappearing into a snowdrift far below. The second sniper had been neutralized. 2 shots, 2 of the 3 threats gone. The sudden shift in power was palpable. The enemy, now without their long-range support, were truly beginning to unravel. Back at the command center at Echo Ridge 12, the chaos was contained within a fortress of technology and protocol. Screens flickered with live data, but the most crucial one, the comms feed, was a dead, silent loop. Colonel Griffin, a man whose face was as hard and unyielding as the granite of the mountains themselves, watched a different screen. It was a tactical overlay, a real-time radar feed that mapped every known position in the Linden Valley. The dots representing the SEAL team were still pinned, but now a new, unexplained anomaly had appeared. 2 distinct data points, separated by a brief interval of time, had been registered. Both originated from the exact same coordinates, the coordinates of Ridge 9. "Run those coordinates again." Griffin's voice was a low growl, devoid of any emotion. "Confirm that position." The analyst, a young woman with a face ashen with stress, tapped frantically on her keyboard. "Sir, they're confirmed. The data is clean. 2 shots fired from Ridge 9 at a range of 2.6 kilometers. Her voice was shaking slightly. Griffin leaned closer to the screen, his eyes narrowing. "That's impossible. Our intelligence flagged Ridge 9 as unscalable. It's a dead zone. There are no friendly snipers deployed in that sector. None. 0. The analyst could only shrug, her hands hovering over the keyboard. The data was the data. The impossible had just happened. In the valley below, the remaining enemy forces were in a state of outright panic. Their leader, a stocky, brutal-looking man who had been directing the ambush from the pine cover behind the SEALs, was shouting orders, his voice a desperate, high-pitched scream. He had lost his machine gunner and his sniper in the space of a minute. The unseen threat from above was something their intel had never mentioned. He raised his radio, his face a mask of bewildered terror. "We are taking fire from Ridge 9. Confirm friendly support. I repeat, confirm friendly support." But there was no one on the other end of the line. The radio, like the SEAL teams, was a dead weight. He lowered it, a look of abject fear washing over his face. He was in command of an ambush that had just turned into a suicide mission. Then came the third shot. It was a final, brutal punctuation mark, a statement of cold, uncompromising purpose. The enemy commander, who had been standing to rally his troops, dropped without a sound, a look of surprise frozen on his face. 3 shots, 3 kills, all with surgical precision. The remaining enemy soldiers, leaderless and terrified, broke rank and began a frantic, disorganized retreat, scrambling back into the treacherous folds of the valley. The kill zone had become a graveyard, and the SEALs, who had been moments from a certain death, were now standing in the center of a silent, snowy canyon. Holt, his body still rigid with adrenaline, slowly stood up. He lowered his binoculars, his gaze fixed on Ridge 9. He didn't need to ask. He knew. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a lucky break. This was the work of a master he had heard whispered about in the hallways of the base, a master who had a ghost in their machine. He looked at his team, their faces a mixture of confusion, relief, and awe. Lieutenant Bennett, his face pale, slowly stood up, his eyes wide. "Commander," he whispered, "who the hell was that?" "They said no snipers were deployed." Holt didn't answer. He simply looked up at Ridge 9, a silent, impassive peak that had just saved their lives. He knew who it was. He knew what she had done. And he knew that he would have to live with the knowledge that a ghost had been waiting in the machine all along. The mission was now an extraction. The comms relay, their original objective, was abandoned. Its guards had retreated with their comrades, leaving it to the wind and the snow. The SEAL team moved with a new sense of urgency, their movements no longer a silent stealth, but a hurried march toward the extraction point. They kept glancing back at Ridge 9, a silent sentinel that had protected them, a silent watcher who had given them a second chance. Meanwhile, Erin Voss was already descending. Her descent was not the frantic, hurried escape of a soldier fleeing a position. It was the calm, methodical return of a woman who had simply finished a job. She moved with the same fluid grace as she had on the way up, her body a perfect instrument of motion. The M2010 was a familiar weight on her back, its cold steel a constant presence. She felt no adrenaline, no surge of triumph. The action for her was not a victory. It was a debt repaid. She reached the perimeter of the base with the same silent efficiency she had left with. The guard on duty was not Jenkins, but a different soldier, a young man who was more concerned with the cold and the lateness of the hour than with the figures moving in the shadows. He didn't even see her. She was a ghost, a whisper in the wind, a figure that slipped through the gates as if she had never left. She walked directly back to her desk in the command center. The officers were still in a state of contained panic, their faces illuminated by the screens, their voices a low, anxious hum. She moved back into her corner, a ghost in her own skin, and sat down. Her field jacket was dusted with the fine, powdery snow of the mountains, a faint white residue that clung to the fabric. Her boots left faint traces of alpine snow on the sterile floor, a small, subtle trail that no one noticed in the chaos. She opened her laptop. On the screen, the comms monitoring feed was still running, a testament to her continuous presence. She had never logged out. The system showed no anomalies, no gaps in her monitoring time. She had simply disappeared for a few minutes, a ghost in the machine who had been there all along. She looked at her laptop screen, its blank black surface reflecting her face, her eyes sharp and focused, no longer buried in the anonymity she had cultivated for 3 years. They held the look of a soldier who had just reconnected with an old part of herself, a part she had tried so hard to bury. The M2010 was already back in its place in the armory. She had cleaned it meticulously on the way down, wiping away every trace of dust and carbon. It was spotless, its once faulty scope now a perfect, precise tool. The logbook, which she had quietly updated on her way back, noted 3 fewer rounds than had been issued. It was a detail that would only be noticed by an analyst. A small anomaly that would likely be dismissed as a clerical error. It was the perfect alibi for a ghost. As the SEAL team finally reached the extraction point, a safe distance from the Valley of Death, Commander Holt's radio crackled to life. It was Colonel Griffin, his voice a tense, measured command. "Holt, identify friendly sniper support. Immediately. Someone just saved your ass." Holt's response was a long, cold sigh. "Sir, there was no one on the ground. We were in a kill zone. Our comms were jammed. Then 3 shots, 3 surgical hits from Ridge 9. We don't know who it was." "Holt, that's impossible." Griffin's voice was tight with disbelief. "Our radar is showing the shots came from Ridge 9. Our intel has flagged that position as unscalable. There are no friendly snipers deployed in your sector. None. Then who the hell was firing in the gorge?" Holt's voice was a mixture of gratitude and dread. He knew who it was, but he couldn't say the name. He couldn't put a label on a ghost. The operation was recorded as a success. The mystery sniper, the Phantom from Ridge 9, would become one of those whispered legends, passed between elite units over a shared drink, a story of an unseen protector with perfect aim. No official link was ever drawn between Erin's brief disappearance and the shots from Ridge 9. But that evening, as the SEAL team returned to the base, Reynolds, the junior member of the team, approached her workstation. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her and gave a silent, respectful nod. Erin looked up from her screen, her expression a mask of feigned innocence. "For what?" she asked. Reynolds simply gave her a knowing smile. "You know what?" he said. He turned to leave, but then turned back. "The wind up there, it shifts every 40 minutes. How did you know?" Erin's expression didn't change. She just looked at him with her quiet, knowing eyes, a silent confession that he would carry with him forever. She knew. She had lived there once. The mystery of the shot from nowhere was, to her, simply a matter of knowing the mountain better than anyone else. The office of Colonel Griffin was a stark, austere space, a reflection of the man himself, polished mahogany, brass fittings, and a single, unadorned map of the region hung on the wall. The air was heavy, charged with a silence that felt more oppressive than any shouted command. Colonel Griffin sat behind his desk, a mountain of a man in his 50s, his face a roadmap of hard-won experience. His eyes, a cold, piercing blue, were fixed on Erin Voss. She stood ramrod straight before him, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, her face a serene, unreadable mask. She was once again the tech girl, the ghost tech, a small, quiet presence in a room full of power. But Griffin knew better. The radar logs, the telemetry from the shots, and the stories whispered by a grateful SEAL unit all painted a different picture. "The data doesn't lie, Erin." Griffin's voice was a low growl, devoid of any anger, but heavy with an unspoken weight. 2.6 kilometers, 3 shots, surgical, from a position that our own intelligence has flagged as unscalable. "I ran the files. Your name is on none of them. Your security clearance, while extensive for a systems analyst, does not include authorization for a tactical field deployment. Nor, for that matter, does it include access to the M2010 sniper rifle, which, by the way, was signed out and returned without an official mission log. You were gone for 18 minutes, and in that time you performed an act that saved a 6-man SEAL unit. I'm giving you a chance to explain. How did you know Ridge 9 could be reached?" Erin's face remained a blank slate. The silence in the room stretched, taut as a wire. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the quiet, measured power of a man who had seen too much to be easily fooled. The silence was a language she understood better than words, a language she had spoken for 3 years. She looked at him, not with defiance, but with a quiet understanding. Her voice, when it came, was a low, even tone, a whisper in the vast empty space of the office. "Because I once lived under those rocks, sir." The words were not a confession. They were a statement of fact, a key that unlocked a door she had sealed shut 3 years ago. The office, the cold air, the hard mahogany, all faded away, replaced by the ghost of a memory, a story that had been buried in the most restricted files of the military. A story about a unit that had been erased from the records, a story of compromised intel, of a brutal ambush, and of a ghost that had refused to die. The world had been different then. She had been call sign 452, part of the Valkyrie Echo Recon Unit. They were an elite 6-man team, specialists in deep mountain infiltration and forward observation. Her teammates were her world. Marcus, the team leader, a quiet, methodical man with a fierce love for his men. Elena, the spotter, with eyes that could pick out a single leaf from a kilometer away. Sergeant Doyle, their demolitions expert, a man with a crude humor and a heart of gold, and the twins, Leo and Lucas, the scouts, 2 men who moved with a silent grace that made them seem more like phantoms than soldiers. Their mission was to be the eyes and ears of the Northern Line campaign, a high-stakes op to secure a path for a humanitarian convoy passing through the Linden Valley. The intel was solid. The mission was a ghost op. But the intel, as they would soon discover, was a lie. The ambush was staged with a brutal, almost poetic efficiency. The enemy forces, far from being a small patrol, were a well-coordinated battalion, waiting for them in a kill zone that was a mirror image of the one the SEALs had just survived. Erin, as the Overwatch, was on Ridge 9, her position a silent, unseen guardian above her team. She had watched, helpless, as the ambush unfolded below. The radios went silent, a signal not of a malfunction, but of a deliberate, malicious jamming. She watched as her team fought, a small, desperate island of resistance against a tidal wave of superior force. She saw Marcus go down, a burst of machine gun fire from a position she hadn't been able to see. She saw Doyle fall, a blast from a well-placed grenade. She saw the twins, moving like ghosts in the shadows, their bodies eventually claimed by the sheer weight of numbers, and all the while she held her position, her orders a chain forged in cold steel. She was the Overwatch. Her job was to watch and to document, not to intervene. Breaking silence would have meant death for the civilian convoy. The memory of those 3 days was a scar etched deep into her soul. She remembered the cold, the hunger, the overwhelming loneliness of being the sole witness to a massacre. She remembered the frostbite on her fingers, the dehydration that made her head swim, the cold, gnawing guilt that ate away at her like a cancer. She had a rifle, she had the skill, she had the opportunity, but she also had a mission, a promise to a convoy of 200 souls she had never met, the lives of her family in the canyon or the lives of a city of strangers. It was a choice that no one should ever have to make. She had chosen the strangers, and in doing so, had sacrificed her own. On the 3rd day, the enemy found the convoy's new path. She watched through her scope as they began to set up a mortar emplacement, a well-camouflaged artillery position designed to lay down a final, devastating barrage. She could feel the vibrations of the mountain as they set up the mortars, a low, ominous tremor that spoke of a massacre to come. Her orders were still firm: maintain silence. But her loyalty to a mission had already cost her team. She would not let it cost the lives of 200 civilians as well. She raised her M2010, the cold steel a familiar presence in her hands. The targets were not the mortar teams themselves, but their forward observers, the eyes that guided the fire. She made the choice. A cold, deliberate decision born of a moral clarity that cut through the fog of her pain. The first shot was a masterpiece of ballistics. The forward observer, a man she had been watching for 3 hours, fell without a sound. The second shot, another clean, perfect hit, eliminated his partner. The third shot, a final definitive action, took out the last observer. The 3 shots, later known as the 452 sequence, saved the convoy. But they also gave up her position. Her silent vigil was over. The mountain, which had been her home, was now her enemy. What followed was a 6-day odyssey of pure survival. An entire battalion of enemy soldiers, now alerted to her presence, was hunting her. She was a single woman, armed with 1 rifle and a handful of rounds, against a force of hundreds. She survived by becoming a ghost in her own right, a phantom of the mountains. She moved only when the storms could mask her thermal signature. She survived on snow and a few meager ration crumbs. She slept in shallow crevices where she could wake, ready to fight in a split second. The mountain, once a silent confidant, became a brutal, unforgiving adversary. She knew its secrets, its paths, its thermal drafts, and she used every single one of them to stay alive. The frostbite on her fingers, the severe dehydration, the combat stress trauma were the souvenirs of a war she had waged and won against impossible odds. When the rescue unit finally found her, 6 days later, she was exactly where she had last been, on Ridge 9, her scope still trained on the canyon where her team had fallen. Her body was broken, but her mind was still intact, her eyes alert and watchful. At the debriefing, she refused to share any tactical details. She declined therapy, and when they offered her medals, rank, special roles, she refused them all. "I held position," she had said, her voice a hollow, empty echo of her former self. It was a statement of fact, not an act of heroism. She had simply done her job. She had done it so well that it had cost her everything. She had asked for reassignment to back-end support, analysis, logistics, anything that would keep her away from the sounds of war, away from the cold reality of the battlefield. She wanted to fade into the system, to become a ghost by choice, and she had done it. For 3 years she had been Erin Voss, the quiet tech girl, the one who worked in the shadows, the one who was never seen with a weapon in her hand. She had become what she had always been, a phantom, a whisper in the machine, a ghost by choice. The office, the cold air, the hard mahogany, all returned to focus. Colonel Griffin was looking at her with a new expression, a mixture of awe and dawning comprehension. The ghost stories, the whispers, the restricted files, they were all a part of her. He looked at the file on his desk, her personnel file, a sparse, almost empty document that spoke of a brilliant analyst with a mysterious past. "Subject displays classical survivor's guilt," he read aloud, his voice a low whisper. "Tactical proficiency is exceptional. Recommend non-combat placement, combat capacity untested." He looked at her, his eyes asking the question that the file could not answer. Her combat capacity had not been untested. She had been a ghost in the machine, a shadow in the system, a master of a war she had won against an impossible enemy. And he, the man who had dismissed her as a tech girl, now saw her for what she truly was. A warrior, a survivor, a legend in her own right. The truth had been buried for 3 years, but the mountain and a 6-man SEAL unit had brought it back to the surface. The file was now marked Restricted Intelligence Asset. Colonel Griffin had closed the file with a quiet, decisive thud, the sound echoing in the silence of his office. He had seen the truth, a truth so profound and so terrifying that it could not be contained within the sterile language of a military file. He had seen the ghost, the phantom who had survived and had returned to save the lives of his men. The standard protocol would have been to discipline her for insubordination, to file a formal complaint for her unauthorized deployment. But Griffin was not a man of protocol. He was a man of results. He looked at Erin, this quiet, unassuming woman who had just saved a 6-man SEAL unit. He saw not a systems analyst, but a soldier who had refused to die, a legend in her own right. He made a decision. She would not return to the back end. She would not be allowed to fade back into the shadows. Her skills were too valuable to be wasted. He offered her a new role, one that she accepted with a reluctant, almost weary resignation. She was to be an instructor, a mentor for a new generation of elite shooters. She was to teach them everything she knew. But there was a condition. She would not teach them how to shoot. She would teach them how to see. Her classroom was not a range with paper targets and a stopwatch. Her classroom was the mountain itself. The training ground was Ridge 9, a place she had once called home, a place of both profound pain and ultimate salvation. The first class was a group of 12 Special Operations volunteers, a mix of SEALs, Rangers, and Marine sharpshooters. They were the best of the best, men and women who had come to learn the technical skills that would give them an edge in combat. They came seeking advanced ballistics, windage calculations, and trigger pull techniques. They were surprised to find that the first week they were not even allowed to touch a rifle. Erin's teaching method was unconventional, born not from a textbook, but from a lifetime of experience. She taught them to breathe with the mountain, to feel the subtle shifts in the wind on their skin, to read the shadows as if they were a language. Her students learned to track the wind by watching how a single snowflake drifted, how a pine needle swayed, how the thermal layers of the air shimmered in the sunlight. They learned to gauge distance not with a laser rangefinder, but by how sound echoed between the cliffs, how the color of a rock faded into the gray of the horizon. They learned to feel the pressure of an approaching weather front, the subtle drop in the air that signaled a storm. She would send them out onto the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Linden Valley, not with rifles, but with binoculars and a notebook, and instruct them to report everything they sensed, not just what they saw. "What do you hear?" she would ask a young trainee. "The wind, ma'am. Maybe some engine noise from the motor pool." "And what don't you hear?" The pause always came. It was the pause of a mind struggling to comprehend a question it had never been asked before. "The birds, ma'am. They stopped singing 3 minutes ago. Something's moving in Sector 7. This was the core of her teaching. It was not about the trigger pull, but about a complete and total awareness, a merging of the mind, the mission, and the terrain into a single, cohesive unit. The rifle, she would tell them, was just the last step in a long, complex conversation they had been having with the world around them. The most advanced students, the ones who had shown a true understanding of her philosophy, were led to the summit of Ridge 9. It was not a celebratory climb, but a pilgrimage, a journey to understand not just the technicalities of the shots she had made, but the philosophy behind them. She would stand at the exact spot where she had fired, where she had watched her team fall, where she had survived against impossible odds. "Every spot has a story," she would say, her voice a low, even tone that carried on the wind. "This one says, 'I see everything, I can reach anything, and I can vanish completely.' But it also says, 'I'm all in. Once I fire from here, getting out isn't the priority. Finishing the job is.'" Her strongest lessons, however, came without words. Some mornings, students would arrive at their posts to find their gear laid out in a pattern, a subtle path marked in the snow, or a puzzle designed to be solved under pressure. One day, a student found a series of targets placed at extreme, unworkable angles around the slope. No clear shooting lane existed. The students spent hours trying to find a position, a vantage point, a way to make the shot. Finally, one of them, a young sniper named Specialist Rios, a man with a quiet, observant demeanor that reminded Erin of herself, stood up. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, even tone. "There is no clean angle." "Correct," she replied. "So what's the move?" "Change the problem. Don't force the shot. Now you're thinking." Rios was her best student, a man who had not only learned her lessons, but had absorbed them into the very fiber of his being. He had a deep, almost instinctual understanding of her philosophy. He knew that the greatest weapon was not a rifle, but patience. And it was that lesson that saved his team. Months later, Rios was on a high-stakes mission, his team pinned down in a tense standoff in a hostile desert environment. They were trapped, their comms jammed, their retreat cut off. The situation was dire. Rios, his heart hammering against his ribs, could feel the panic rising in his chest. But then he remembered Erin's lessons. He remembered the feeling of the wind on his skin, the subtle shifts in the sand, the way the sound echoed off the rocks. He didn't force the shot. He remained hidden for 9 hours, a ghost in the desert, listening to the mountain. He waited for the perfect moment. The moment when the wind was just right, when the enemy commander was just a hair's breadth from his line of sight, when the sun was in the perfect position to blind the enemy's spotter. He waited, and then he took 2 shots. 2 surgical, perfect hits that saved his entire team. When he returned to the base, he gave an interview about the mission. "Before you even touch a rifle," he said, his voice a low, reverent tone, "learn to listen. The mountain speaks first." It was a quote he had learned from a quiet, unassuming systems analyst, a ghost who had taught him that true precision came not from a rifle, but from a complete and total awareness. Then, one morning, Erin was gone. The base had no record of her transfer, no exit debrief, no official goodbye. On her desk, cleaned and perfectly placed, was the M2010. Beside it, a small notebook, a single line written inside. "I don't leave traces, I leave vision." The final security footage showed her walking out of the gates at 3:47, carrying only a standard hiking pack. Her signal vanished exactly where the Ridge 9 trail began. Search crews combed the area but found nothing. It was as if the mountain had welcomed her back, taking her in as one of its own. But her legacy did not disappear. Ridge 9 became a discreet training site for elite snipers across the world. Every year, on the day she rescued the SEALs, a silent group hikes to the summit. They stand for 1 full minute overlooking the canyon below, and in every mind, a single figure stands quietly, a ghost in the wind, a silent protector. Her handwritten notes continued to appear on the summit, carved into stone, written on weatherproof scraps. Patience defeats panic, invisible beats invincible, and the mountain remembers everything. Make sure it remembers you with respect. The plaques, the notes, the whispers, it was her legacy. It was the vision she had left behind. She had taught them that legends don't need names, they only need the courage to show up when it matters. And for the soldiers who climbed Ridge 9, who learned to listen to the mountain, they knew the quiet truth. Erin Voss had never left. She was still there, in the wind, in the snow, in the heart of every soldier she had taught. She was a legend, a ghost, a myth made real, and her lessons would save lives long after the teacher was gone. Thank you for staying with us and for listening to the story of Erin Voss, a true ghost in the machine. Her story is a powerful reminder that some of the greatest heroes don't wear medals or hold high rank. They are the ones who operate in the quietest corners, who carry burdens no one else can see, and who find the strength to act when all hope seems lost. Her legacy wasn't built on a pedestal, but was etched into the unyielding rock of a mountain she knew better than anyone. It's a legacy of silence, of patience, of knowing that the greatest weapon isn't the rifle in your hands, but the wisdom in your heart. Erin taught us that true precision comes not from a perfect shot, but from a complete and total awareness, a profound connection to the world around us. She showed us that a legend isn't about what you take from the world, but what you choose to leave behind. She left behind a vision, a way of seeing the world that continues to save lives long after she became one with the mountain. Her story is a testament to the fact that some promises, forged in the fires of loss and survival, are too sacred to be broken. They are the promises we make to ourselves and to the memory of those who are gone. On the Veteran Biker channel, we believe these are the stories that matter most. We believe that legends aren't just characters in a book or names on a plaque. They are the quiet, everyday people who find the courage to show up when it counts, who face their demons and emerge stronger for it. We are a community of storytellers and seekers, of people who ride the open road and listen for the whispers of the past. If Erin's story spoke to something inside you, if it reminded you that courage isn't a loud roar but a silent, unwavering decision, we want to hear from you. Tell us in the comments below what part of her story resonated with you the most, and let us know what you think of her final silent promise. We hope you'll join us on our journey. If you want to keep hearing stories of the unseen heroes, of the quiet protectors, and of the legends that live on in the shadows, please hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss another tale. Give this video a like if you believe that sometimes the greatest acts of bravery are the ones that no one ever sees. And if you're ready for another story, please check out the videos appearing on your screen right now. Until next time, stay safe out there on the road, and always remember to listen for the quiet whispers that the world has to offer. They just might save your life.